Great. Hi, everyone. So as part of our wider Growing for Change campaign to support London's food gardens and building community, climate, and nature resilience funded by the City Bridge Foundation, this webinar showcases our two recently launched practical guides developed in partnership with the countryside charity CPRE London. They cover how you can protect a food growing site for the future and ways to save one if ever under threat, and we'll be taking a peek at them together later. We have some fantastic contributors. We're very grateful for speaking on the subject today, which are John Sadler, CPRE London's campaigns officer, Gillian Morgan, Sustains Planning Advisor, Henry Peterson, Chair of St. Quintin and Woodlands Neighborhood Forum, and Sarah Williams, Sustains Programs Director, which, fun fact, is also one of the first people to work on Capital Growth when it started back in 2009. So thank you to each of those speakers for joining us today. And I also want to just say that these guides would not have been possible without any key input from both John and Gillian. And rest assured, I'll be introducing all of our contributors in more details when they'll be speaking shortly. After our speakers, just to note, we'll also have time to answer some questions from the audience and invite participants to share their own personal experiences of protecting sites. So be sure to stick around for that too. Okay, so that's our housekeeping intros. I'll stop there and introduce you to our first speaker, John Sadler. John is CPRE's London's campaigns officer, who has worked on a range of projects to protect and improve the green belt and other green spaces within the city. John has worked in operational, outreach, and campaigning roles at environmental NGOs over the past 15 years. At the Ramblers Association, he managed to Keep Walking project in East London. He also coordinated marine policy and campaigns for wildlife and Countryside Link. And he was the Humane Society International's operation manager before joining CPRE London in 2021. John loves walking, and his favorite green space in London is Hampstead Heath. Today, he'll be talking to us about the work of CPRE London and protecting green spaces. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Maya, and big thanks also should go to Maya for coordinating this joint project. And it's been fantastic to work with Sustain to create these resources, which can hopefully help you protect your food growing sites well into the future so you can continue to enjoy them. What I'm going to talk about today really can be split into about 4 sections. I'll give a brief introduction to the work that CPRE London does. Then I'll talk about the sort of context that we're in. Why are green spaces and food growing sites potentially under threat in London? What are the alternatives to that? And finally, what can you do to protect your food growing site as well? So just to kick off with CPRE London, we're a very small charity, part of the bigger Campaign to Protect Rural England charity, which has satellite offices across the country. And we are the London branch. So we're quite unusual in that we're probably one of the most urban of those branches. But that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of green spaces to protect in London. And we have parks, nature reserves, food growing spaces. And we also have the green belt, which surrounds London. And much of that falls into the Greater London Authority, and some local councils as well are responsible for that. So the Greater London area does have an awful lot of green space, and it should be protected. And unfortunately, over the years, much of this green space has been nibbled away at very gently, like a cake on a plate, with a lot being built on, and only those battles continue right up to today. CPRE London works in various ways. Firstly, we aim to protect the existing green space that there is in London, so what parks and green belt is left, and also to increase the amount of green space in London through projects to green London through tree planting. We have a project potentially on the cards for next year to create a tree ring around London, which is joining up spaces of woodland. So there are wildlife corridors for nature, and that could be a sort of green belt in itself around London. And also we have a project called 10 New Parks for London, which are looking at areas of green space across the capital which are fenced off or neglected, and trying to bring these back into public use and working with local groups. There's more about all of these projects on our website. I think it's also important to note at this point that the value of green space, which many of you will probably be aware of, but there are clear health benefits to green space in London, both mental health, physical health, for families and young people. Everybody enjoys green space. And I think the pandemic showed that particularly as well, that we needed those parks and places to go to exercise in these built up cities. And there's also the climate change aspect of green space as well. And the need for green space which can cool London and act as a sink for carbon, but also in terms of having trees and wildlife as well. And we're interested in all these aspects of green space, environmental, health and social. It's all key to creating a healthy London, which is the objective of CPRE London. Okay, so that's a little bit about what we do. As Gillian was saying, I manage the campaigns for CPRE London as well. And the main area of our work is dealing with and responding to threats to green space. And we have a casework load of over 50 cases currently of different parks and nature reserves and sections of Greenbelt which are under threat from development, and where we are supporting local campaigners and the community groups to protect those as best we can. Among them is Park Road allotments, which many of you will be aware of, which we have supported to some extent, although it's a very well-motivated local group, and that is currently an ongoing campaign, and there is no outcome as far as I know. I haven't just been on leave, need to check the latest on that. But so it's a full range. It's a full range of work. And I think moving on to the second strand of what I want to talk about, why are these green spaces under threat? Why are food growing sites potentially going to be under threat in the coming years? And I think the main reason for this really is sort of about resources, and it's about the housing crisis and the financial crisis and cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in. There are an awful lot of things there which local authorities are having to consider, and they have very high housing targets. Each London local council will have high housing targets which they have to meet, but at the same time, they don't really have the resources to build those houses because their funding from central government is being cut. And that presents a very difficult scenario for them. So they are always on the lookout for areas of land which they own already quite often, because the cost of land to buy and to build on is very expensive. And that's where food growing sites and little green spaces around estates and also some parks sometimes are coming under threat, because they're quite often council owned, and they're seen as an easy win and a way to build quickly for local authorities to meet these housing targets and deal with things such as affordable housing and homelessness and all these issues that we are concerned about as well. And I think the political aspect of this is also important to note, that every local authority is usually run in London by one of the two main political parties. But across London, we see both political parties, neither of them really standing up to protect green space in various ways. We have Labour councils who are building on parks and green spaces in the Green Belt, and the same with the Conservative Party as well. So really, politically, both parties have a lot of work to do to really step up and realise the benefits of green space, and also do some work to protect it as well. And that's something that we've been pushing for as well. We are a non-political organisation, CPRE London, but we do have to do an awful lot of campaigning with the main political parties to get them to understand those benefits. And I think finally, why are green spaces under threat? I think because I think developers and landowners, they're very keen to make a profit, and people who own your food growing spaces, you may be in touch with them, you may be talking to them already, but some of these people may be wanting to sell the land to make a profit, and the best way to make a profit is to build on those spaces. So it's a tricky scenario to face. And it brings us on to sort of the third part of what I wanted to talk about, which is about what are the alternatives to this? We've set out a narrative here, and this narrative about building on green space is something that you will hear from the main political parties, and you will hear from local councils, that there are these crises and there's no space, and what should we do? And it's a very good question, but unfortunately the answers they're coming up with aren't the right ones, because building on the green belt and building on green parks and space and estate green spaces, food growing sites, is definitely not the answer to the housing crisis. The housing crisis has multiple layers to it, and you know, I'm not going to go into too much depth here about that, but there are ways in which houses and affordable housing can be provided in London, which doesn't involve building on green space. And one of the main ways to do that is to build only on previously developed land and brownfield land. And there is plenty of brownfield land in London, previously developed sites to do that. And CPRE London has written a report on the brownfield land that is available, and there's certainly a lot of it. And also a lot of grey space, concrete space, surface car parks, curbside space. A lot of London is taken up with space for the car. And quite often local authorities don't look at these areas. They don't think creatively in the way that they want to build. They just look for the nearest green space. They don't think, oh, if we built over that car park or put that car park as an underground car park, then perhaps, you know, we could save the park nearby and make that into a greener place. So they aren't really thinking creatively, and they're not really looking at ways to make London a healthier place to live in for people. They're just thinking about building. And the final aspect is that although building and it can be important, unfortunately, a lot of housing is not affordable. And with a lack of affordable housing, that means that building on the Greenbelt will quite simply create more large, unaffordable properties, which are quite often bought by people who might not live in the local area. Certainly, they're not always very cost effective. And there are other ways to deal with those issues, such as ending right to buy, which has reduced the amount of social housing in London massively. Also introducing rent controls. And also thinking about all those empty properties in London, office spaces, commercial properties, houses which have been purchased by maybe people overseas and never used or left empty. And how do we actually think about getting those places back into use and back into affordability to solve the housing crisis for homeless people and people who want to buy their first home and so on. And as the things stand, the current situation politically, we are going to, unfortunately, may well see a continuation of this problem until those key issues are addressed. And that's why today we're very keen to sort of suggest to you that you do all you can to protect your food growing sites as best you can now, because so many of the cases that we see at CPRE London in terms of threats to green space come about far too down the line to be able to do anything about them when we find out about it, because the actions haven't been done at an earlier stage when there is time to do so. So protect your spaces now, even if they're not under threat, and that will avoid problems starting and mean that you can be more secure. I mean, nothing is foolproof, but it certainly helps. And we'll talk later, and you'll hear from Gillian and Maya about the importance of using designations to protect food growing sites. And I think that's a key way of starting that process, is designating your food growing site as a local green space, because once these local green spaces are designated, councils will find it much harder to sell off that land for housing because there is a clear sort of planning protection there, and there is also a demonstration of the interest and the involvement of the community in that space, that they've taken the effort to go to the council and get it protected through neighbourhood planning or through a local plan. And the final thing is just to add to that, because I don't want to scare you, because you know, it's quite possible your site will be fine, but these are just the security to ensure that you have those protections that would be best for you. It's important to monitor threats to green space. So if you know anything that's coming up that might be a risk, it's important to keep up to date on that. Read your local paper, keep in touch, talk to other people in the local area to make sure there's nothing coming down the line that might be worrying. And also, I think keep good relationship with the landowner if at all possible, because quite often it comes down to personalities, and having a good relationship with your landowner will help enormously in that, and might even protect it as well. Just to conclude, we have a problem with green space in London. A lot of it is under threat. Nothing is really safe, but you could do an awful lot to help that by protecting your site, keeping an eye out, keeping a good relationship with your landowner, and also having a good read of the resources that we produced with Sustain, which there are links on the booking page, this website. And there are 2 versions. And just to clarify, there is one piece of guidance for people whose food growing site is not currently under threat, but you'd like to do something to protect it for the future. And for those people who are actively fighting a battle now, or believe that you're within a situation where your site could become under threat, there is guidance about how to run a really strong political campaign and demonstrate public use and win the argument to hopefully protect it. So that's everything, and thanks ever so much for listening, and very welcome, to answer questions. Very interested to answer any questions you have at the end. Just stick them in the comments, and that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, John. That was a really great sort of overview, lay of the land, literally. So thank you very much for that. I think one of the big things to kind of start strong with this webinar, and I'm sure it will be picked up by the rest of the speakers, and if not the whole theme, is prevention is key. So I really appreciate you kind of really starting off on that note, and also mentioning the 2 resources. If I could ask Lily to pop, and Kate, if possible, to sort of pop links to those in the chat in case people are curious to download them. We recently launched them perhaps 2 weeks ago, so they're fresh off the press. And some people might have already read them, and it'd be really great to hear your feedback. So please do send us any emails of things, thoughts and things to build on. Okay, on that, thank you very much again, John. I will move on to Gillian Morgan. Gillian supports Sustainable Food Places, which is another Sustain project, to engage in the plan-making process to ensure that community food growing has been taken into account in their local plans, as well as being a planner who is specialized in the strategic planning and management of green space from the local level in London boroughs through to national park level as planning director in the Norfolk and Suffolk boroughs. Gillian is a passionate gardener, very passionate. She started volunteering with Capital Growth, meeting inspirational community food growers across the city, and has gone on to publish Sustain's guidance for planners on writing planning policies to support community food growing. So Gillian, as you very well know with these guides, I think one of the important topics that we're looking at that isn't necessarily widely discussed is relating to protecting your food space, is the whole concept of designations. So what I wanted to sort of start by asking you is, what is a designation actually? Because that, for me, to start with, before even having started with Capital Growth almost 3 years ago now, I didn't really understand the context of that word, or the concept of that word in this context. So I'd really appreciate setting us off with that definition.
I think any designation is an external validation, as it were, of your site. So sort of any name that is recognizable locally as a protection for open space, and that's a recognition that that open space is in active beneficial use to the community. We're talking here mostly about planning, and in that context, any planning application, the first thing that the planning officer will do in thinking about whether the application should go through or not is to look at that site and see whether there are any policies or designations on it already that then show that have been agreed through a formal process called the local plan, that will then give the starting point for the determination of that application. And so in the report, in this guidance, we've gone specifically into some of those that you will come across. And most people have heard of the green belts, or sites of special scientific importance for nature, those sort of really high level nationally recognised designations. And so those are the upper levels of designation. But lots of local authorities, and I've seen in the chat that we've got people from outside London as well, lots of local authorities have their own categories that they've made up themselves. They're just a local category. So that's fine as well. Find out if there are any local designations that you can apply to have over your site.
Gillian, could I just ask real quick to reiterate, because I also would like Lily to pull up the guides as well, if she can show us and give people a bit of a sneak peek if they haven't already seen it. So what you're saying is basically a designation is in a sort of officially recognized status that is assigned to a space, right? And then if we could even peel it back and talk about what planning actually is, because I don't know necessarily, even for myself, that was a concept that I completely understood or even knew how to engage with. So if we could kind of even take it back to that level, would you mind sharing a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, the first thing that happens in a local authority area is that a planning authority should have a local plan in place. And that's a legal process of working with your communities, with your landowners, to look at the future of your place and try and see where is the best place for development, and if development is to take place, what are the criteria for good development in your place. And because it's very high level, it's quite theoretical, community food growers and other community groups tend not to get involved in it. And the time that communities get involved in planning is when there's a planning application. As John said, you're up in arms about it. You say this can't possibly go ahead. But that decision must be made according to the national and local planning policies. So if that site has already been allocated as a development site, you're onto a loser. But if it's been identified already as a local green space through the local plan, which is one of the key designations we want to promote today, then immediately the developer is on the back foot and you're on the front foot. You've got your site protected. It might not, there's all sorts of other criteria will be discussed, but your starting point is from a protected site. And so I think what we want to say is don't wait until your site is under threat. Get in there first. Make sure you've got planning policies in your local area that protect food growing space and that look for new food growing spaces to be dedicated within the area, and that current sites, local spaces of importance to the community, are given the local green space designation. And that might be something new to your local council. It's been around for about 10 years and nobody's taken much notice of it. And we'll hear later on from somebody who's actually sort of pushed to get to use that designation. So I think a lot of local authorities have kind of forgotten about it. It's in with all the words. And so when you ask for that, you might have to use the information from this resource to say, please start using this designation in our area.
Okay, that's a great, that leads me on to this next question. Thank you, Gillian. Which was raised by Sarah in the chat, is how do you find out what local designations there are in your area? How would one go about looking for that?
Where you look on the search engine for your local plan and read through your local plan. There'll be a proposals map in it, so you can look at the different categories of designations there are on the proposals map. There'll be transport, housing, heritage, all different sorts. So identify the ones that are about green space, and then you'll start to get familiar with the categories and the terms that are used. They're all online, so you can do word searches for open space, food growing. Sustain has an online toolkit to help you do this, to help you take it step by step by step, so that you can look at your current local plan, see what it says, and see where the gaps are. And so when there's a review of your local plan, it helps you submit responses to their consultations to tell them you're out there, and that food is important in your local area, and that food growing in particular has the mental health, physical health, climate change, environmental, biodiversity. It ticks all the boxes. But planners are so busy and they're so focused on achieving these housing numbers. It actually needs local activists to go forward to them and say, hang on a minute, you haven't got enough in here about protecting food spaces, food growing spaces.
I really appreciate that, as well as sort of understanding where a planner's mindset might be at and how to sort of argue almost for more buy-in from them. And I was also wondering, so thinking about how people would actually look up their local plan, you're basically suggesting they would literally go onto any sort of web search engine, type in local plan, their borough, and then pull up the documents, and then can also refer to Sustain's planning toolkit to be able to help decipher how to go about looking for what it is you want in those local plans, and then going to actually contact planning officers to then ask what local designations might be currently available and request that further space. Is that correct?
Yes. The national guidance on the local green space designation says that this should take place when the local plan is reviewed, because if you think about it, you're asking for a designation that's going to go over a piece of land, and if you don't own that land, it's the implications for designating it as a local green space will rebound on the landowner, and the landowner will say, well, how did this happen? You know, I own that land. Or a developer who has had their eye on that land is going to say, oh, yeah, I'm not too keen on that because I wanted that piece of land. So the time for those debates, and when it's all in the public domain, is when there's a neighbourhood plan being produced, or whether the local plan is being produced. And at the start of reviewing a local plan, because most places already have one, there'll be a call for sites. What we're finding is that those call for sites are for housing sites or employment sites. And most local authorities, very, very few, are calling for sites for other uses. And that is the time to say, oh, hang on, aren't you supposed to be asking at this stage for a call for local green space sites? And they'll go, oh, where does it say that in national planning guidance? And this resource will give you the paragraph number that where it says that they should be doing that. So you're going to have to push a bit because, as I said, they might not have thought about it.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Gillian. And then I'm also thinking, with the local plans, there isn't sort of one date that everybody follows through with. So it's going to be different cycles, right? So it is really understanding your context and the timings around that to be able to start to even engage in a conversation with your local council and the local plan.
Yes, so on the website there should be a timetable, so you can see how up to date or out of date your current local plan is. And there should be some indication of what their review process is. If there isn't, then either you can try and contact your planning department or contact your local councillor and ask them to find out for you. And that in itself will be a good way to raise the issue about, we're on this land, we're using this land, and we feel it should be recognised through the planning system and given some level of protection. either in a generic policy or in a specific one that covers this site. Come down, come and have a look at us, see what we're doing,
Mm.
you know, sort of, so that they can understand the wonderful things that happen on your site. And then you're starting to build up that engagement with the council.
Right, it kind of ties in with what John was saying earlier in terms of keeping that good relationship or establishing it to begin with. And then it makes me wonder as well, if people are, you know, having to develop that relationship, persistence is key, right? Because it is something that you might not necessarily have a response from the first go, but it is about persisting with building that relationship.
Yeah, yes, it is. And I think sort of one of the elements on here is about building up the evidence of what you do and how good you are and the impacts that you're having. And we've seen some good examples where sites have their own Facebook page, and then just by having advertising your events, having photographs of your events, that forms a really good record that if the organisers change and they move away and a new organiser comes, you've always got that record. You know, they don't take all the photos in a suitcase away with them. Something like a Facebook page, you know, you can go back over the years and say, well, this is what it looked like. Everyone will have forgotten that it looked like a derelict bit of concrete covered in brambles. Because they'll see your beautiful site. You're saying, well, this is what it looked like. This is what we've done. This is what we've achieved. This is the productivity we grow all these different fruits over the year. This is the number of people that come here that actively garden or just come and talk to us or just come and sit and think. And just measure all those impacts, the things that you know about as an organizer. It happens every week. You don't think it's remarkable, but it's all evidence that you will need to submit to say this site is important to our local community.
Oh, I really appreciate that too, because it is about, you know, documenting, evidence building, case making, and being able to really show the interest and value. I think John mentioned those two words as well, of any site. So thank you very much for that, Gillian. I was wondering actually if you could sort of, we could just run through the designations that we do mention in the resources real quick before we move on to Sarah. Oh, sorry, to Henry.
Well, the main one we talk about is the local green space, because we think this is a huge potential, and that's at a national level. So it's definitely worth everybody looking at that. And also following through, CPRE have done a full report, and they've just recently published an update on the use of local green space and where it's used, and where perhaps or where the gaps are. So we think local green space really needs to be used, and let's push that. Let's get it to work. The second sort of designation isn't a planning designation as such, but it's a field in trust deed of dedication. So that's one of these ways where you could protect your site, sort of, in perpetuity, I think, almost. And then another one is asset of community value, where you could register your site, and if there is a threat, you would be offered the ability to buy it, and that isn't always possible because of the land value, but it might be possible. But in terms of the sort of more planning recognised designations, the other ones, a green belt. So about 30 cities, I think, have green belts. And that's very specific protection to maintain the openness of land. And specific to London, right? No, the one that's specific to London is Metropolitan Open Land. Right. Okay. So yeah, there's about 30 odd green belts in the country as a whole, obviously, and including around London.
Right.
But it's most likely that the sorts of sites we're talking about are going to be up in the urban area. Metropolitan open land was a London designation because the green belt is so far away from most of the residents of London. Greenbelt was more, metropolitan open land was more of a linear open space that brings major areas of open space into the city rather than around it in a ring. But that's designated at a London-wide level and very rarely changes. It has the same status as Greenbelt, but it tends to be more under threat and nibbled away at. So by being metropolitan open land doesn't mean it's an absolute no-no that development will take place. So yeah, not to be complacent about it if you are in MOL.
Right.
And then we go into a couple of nature conservation sites. So some are local, and that's a local site. Well, this is a case where I think a lot of areas will have their own names for these sites. And site of special scientific interest is a national level designation for nature conservation. But it could well be possible that your site was within one of those. But it's very much more likely that you're going to be in the urban fabric. And therefore, I think local green space is going to be the one that's important.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Julian, for running us through that. If you haven't already downloaded the guides, I really recommend doing so. Again, these are a starting point for guides. So if you do have any other input you'd like to feed in based on your own experience with designations or other ways to protect your food growing spaces, please do let us know via email. If I could also now move on to Henry, who, speaking of local green space, will be sharing experience about, you know, how they actually obtained local green space designation, LGS designation, for St. Quintin and Woodlands via their neighborhood forum. Henry has worked in London local government until 2005 as Director of Policy and Administration at London Borough, Hammersmith and Fulham. For a further 5 years, he worked with the Local Government Association and the NHS, what was then the government's localism agenda. He now chairs a neighborhood forum in North Kensington and acts as an advisor to a forum in nearby East Acton. He's also one of the 3 conveners of Neighbourhood Planners London, the network for those involved in neighbourhood planning in London. So over to you, Henry.
Thanks, Maya. So this is an example of achieving local green space designations through a neighbourhood plan. Kensington, as people know, very high land values. The designation, as has been explained, dates back about 10 years now, oddly enough, part of the original David Cameron localist agenda. The simplest way of getting a designation is to have a local authority willing to put it in their own local plan. You don't then have to go through the process of preparing a neighbourhood plan, which is unavoidably a pretty big commitment. And the London experience is that they do usually take several years to complete. But there is the possibility of shortcutting that. So this is a bit of a wordy slide, but it's important because it explains the legal criteria you have to meet in the National Planning Policy Framework to get your site designated. The first one is pretty obvious. The last one, C, is similarly obvious in the sense that you can't ask for a great swathe of green belt or an enormous park area to be designated. There's no particularly precise definition of what is an extensive tract of land, but they can be small. And as you'll see, some of our 3 are pretty small. The middle one is the interesting one because this is unusual in planning terms, because you're not reliant on professional planning officers in local authorities or heritage specialists saying this is a special site and should be given this designation, you simply have to demonstrate that your local community believes that it should, and the characteristics for doing that are quite wide. Demonstrably special is an interesting term. We found to demonstrate that we had to do, a major petition and get some 1,500 names on it to get the council interested in being supportive and so forth. But that part of it, in a sense, is genuinely in the hands of a local community. And if you can make out a good case, then you can achieve this result. But you do need to meet all three of A, B, and C. It's no good just meeting two of them. And then, as been mentioned, once you've got it, it's a strong form of protection because it's equivalent to green belt. So if you're in a non-parished area, and most of London is non-parished, and same applies to most cities, you can't get your parish council doing the neighbourhood plan. You have to set up a neighbourhood forum. And that sounds a huge task, but in a sense, the criteria are not demanding. 21 more people get together, or you use an existing residents association or amenity group to make the application and so forth. You could decide the boundary. You need a constitution, all pretty basic. The local authority will consult on your application, and providing you get a majority of people supporting it rather than opposing it, the local authority is not bound to agree to it, and some of them will go out of their way to make life difficult for neighbourhood forums. Planning departments in London were quite taken aback by the idea that groups of local people could put in place these neighbourhood plans that had some real statutory force. Kensington were not keen on the idea at the beginning and were quite sniffy. Neighbourhood Planners London is a good resource. It's a London network that's been around since neighbourhood planning started back in 2012. So that's the area of North Kensington involved. Not a huge area, about 1,700 households. The large area there, where my cursor is, that is an existing park, so that's already protected. The areas that we managed to get designated are this one, Nursery Lane, which was a Clifton Nurseries site originally. This one, which had been a bowling green and remains a bowling green to this day, and this one owned by the Methodist Church, which I'll come back to. So all three were in private ownership. They all had landowners, and Nursery Lane were not at all keen on the idea of their land being designated. Family who live in North Yorkshire, part of a large family with a stately home, but I think they've always seen this site in Kensington as a family asset that they were going to cash in on one day. So those were the three. Bowling Green, in a sense, the most straightforward. That's also an asset of community value. The site, the Kelfield Methodist Church site, owned by the Methodists, and they were fine about the idea of being designated, not interested in developing it themselves. The Nursery Lane one was the contentious one, a pretty scruffy site, which Clifton Nurseries used to manage to grow their plants, but moved off the site. And that was when we began to get alarmed that a development interest would appear. Bowling Green, so, can also fall subject to developer interests, and that's happened in a lot of places up and down the country. So actually putting together a neighbourhood plan, it is a serious task, and it does take a long time, and there are some processes of consultation that you have to go through to get there. But as it says there, nobody's yet tried this, but in theory it's possible, because it's the forum that decides what they want to put in the plan and what they want it to focus on. And there's no reason why you couldn't have a single issue plan which you talk to your local authority about, and you say, would like to do one that simply looks at biodiversity and some local green space protections, and we're not going to cover housing, we're not going to cover transport, we're not going to cover other things. As I say, no one's tried it yet, but someone could give it a go. And then once they get adopted, they become part of the statutory local development plan, what Maya was asking questions about, the thing you look up of your local authority, its local plan, its policy map and site designations and so forth. And it becomes an inherent part of that and basically has the same statutory force as what the local authority has produced. As I say, you have to do these 2 consultation periods, and then the plan in draft has to be independently examined by a figure similar to a planning inspector. They don't have to be someone from the planning inspectorate. There is a system of run by RICS, in fact, that you can say, we need an inspector for our plan. You liaise with the local authority on the choice of inspector, but interestingly, you can exercise a form of veto. So as a forum, you want to look around for an inspector that is as supportive and sympathetic to neighbourhood planning as you can find. And we did ours in the fairly early days of neighbourhood planning, and we did work pretty hard to find someone who we thought would be helpful. Then you have the challenge of meeting the 3 criteria. And as I say, B is one of the most important, and that's where you need to put in the work. And we had to do a good deal of lobbying with a council that was not immediately very enthused, but we managed to turn that round over time, because basically, if you can get, as on any planning issue, your ward councillors, your local councillors, to understand that there is a good deal of feeling on the subject, they start taking note because of votes, forthcoming local elections and so forth. And then last slide, I mean, Kensington and Chelsea have been good on supporting what they call kitchen gardens, which are small sites, usually ones that they own. And these take the form of mini allotments. There's several sides of a tennis court or so. It's become redundant, and they've got an increasing number of those. We would like to try and persuade them to acquire the Nursery Lane site, because that is the one where we have already fought off 2 major planning applications. And that was quite a struggle in each case. We were pleased when the examiner of our neighbourhood plan said, yes, all 3 can be designated. We'd been pretty optimistic about 2 of them, but not the Nursery Lane site, because that had a landowner who was already very opposed and had already put in an application for 20 townhouses. So it became a battle as to whether we were going to get our neighbourhood plan adopted in time. We had to argue prematurity, which is a planning argument that often ends up in the courts, where you say this consent should not be granted because we've nearly done our neighbourhood plan and so forth. And to be fair, then the planning officers did start being supportive and persuaded the landowner they weren't going to approve and consent the application for townhouses, and persuaded them to withdraw the application. We then thought, fine, it's secure forevermore. Not the case. A couple of years back, we started seeing the landowners line up with a new developer, a Scottish care home luxury brand, who put in an application for a 72-bed private care home. So in the last year, we've had to fight that one off too. But we have done so, and the council's refused that again. And as has been said earlier, a local green space designation is a pretty good form of protection. It won't always work. Just as with Green Belt, applicants can spend money using expensive consultants, Savills and the like, to get round Green Belt designation as well as local green space designation. But so far, so good. And we are glad that that's where we've got to so far. Thanks.
Amazing, Henry. Thank you very much for sharing that. It sounds like you have been through a lot with managing to get the local green space designation there. Would that be an accurate summary?
It was one of about 3 issues on which we wanted to do a neighbourhood plan. We also we saw some sites which would be quite good for mixed use housing. So we wanted, in a sense, to promote those in a rather rundown employment zone, which wasn't working. So we did sort of strike a balance in our neighbourhood plan, and we identified some new sites for housing. And I think that's why we got the council on board in agreeing these local green space designations, because, as has been said, all the London boroughs are under the cosh in terms of their housing targets. So it is uphill work to persuade them to go down the local green space route.
Yes, I definitely understand that. And actually, I think it's something we mentioned in one of the guides, which is being proactive about solutions, actually looking up alternatives to be able to propose other sites that they may be used for these things. So it's great to know that you've done that, and it did get good support, or at least was well received by the councillors who were working to fight to get LGS for your spaces. If I'm also correct, you don't as of yet have food growing on any of those sites, but is that the intention?
No, we have several of these kitchen gardens that the council started. We're now talking to the council and saying, why don't you use this site? It would be ideal. It's got a sort of row of timber buildings, which would be ideal for them to store their equipment and all their wheelbarrows and spades for the other kitchen gardens and the like. It would be ideal for mini allotments, but they would have to acquire it from what could be a reluctant landowner, or would have to persuade them to use CPO powers, which is not something that most Conservative councils are keen on. They are reluctant to interfere in private property rights.
Okay. So that's not the avenue anybody.
Well, we'll give it a go.
Okay.
I mean, the landowner might realise. I mean, the landowners have lost a lot of money promoting two schemes that haven't worked. So we'll see.
And speaking of money, though, I wonder as well, how much of an investment had to be made also on your part as the neighborhood forum to be able to get the surveys done and to mobilize as such?
That's a good question. There is a government program still. I mean, neighborhood planning, I think a lot of people thought it might be a 2 or 3 year wonder and then disappear from the planning system, but it has survived. There is always been a government program which is levelling up Duluth as a government department. So they run a program of support, which can give financial support for a neighbourhood forum when it's first set up. It's not a lot. I think it was about 8,000 when we started, then it went up to 10, not sure where it is now in the latest iteration of the support. And the local authority can also apply for funding to deal with the local referendum that you have as part of the process. Because once the draft has been looked at by the examiner, it does go to a referendum, and you've got to get a majority at that local referendum for the plan to be put in place. And most of them have had that majority. Ours was, 90%. So some have been much closer, 1 or 2 cases in which at the end of the day, local electorate in that patch, it's only in the small neighbourhood boundary that get to vote. 1 or 2 have been voted down.
Okay, interesting. So it is also a lot of campaigning work. There is a lot of, having to put in the work, as you said.
Yes.
To have the right people on your side too.
You need in your forum, you need a few people, ideally with some planning experience or architectural experience or something. Though I'm not a professional planner, and I did work in local government, so I could deal with how councils operate and their ways and so forth. But I'm not a professional planner. It's quite a steep learning curve. But planning is not rocket science at the end of the day, frankly.
It's just pretty much about engaging it, sort of decoding it and engaging with it, and persisting, I guess, is the thing that keeps coming back to my mind, because it definitely feels like there is a lot to.
There's a lot of jargon in the planning profession, and armies of consultants who now use that jargon in their own interest. But at the end of the day, you can wade in there and have some impact.
No, and I'm very glad you mentioned that, because one of the key things with the resources was even just breaking down that jargon to be able to develop those resources so that the language in itself was accessible for a majority to engage with. So thank you for mentioning that. Thank you, Henry. That was really great to hear, and really great work. Well done. And it's really nice to see that there are examples of that happening. And even the whole neighborhood forum group coming together. I'm quite inspired by that. But we'll move on to Sarah now, last but not least, who'll share a little bit more about our Growing for Change campaign, which kind of ties in with this work of protecting food growing spaces, as well as how you can get involved with the campaign. So Sarah is our programs director for Sustain and a member of the senior leadership team, having joined in 2009, like I mentioned, to run Capital Growth campaign. which supported the development of 2012 new community growing gardens in London for the 2012 Olympics, if I remember correctly, Sarah. Sarah's developed several new programs at Sustain, including the sort of Good to Grow Days of Action that happened around springtime, which was previously known as Big Dig, and Growing Health, and more recently Bridging the Gap. Sarah's work focuses on local action and includes overseeing sustainable food places, London Food, and sustained food growing programs. So I'll pass that over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. And I think Lily's going to share my slides that I've done. Can you all hear me? All right. Well, let me know if you can't hear me, but I'm assuming you can. So I am, yeah, as I say, I just wanted to take a little quick step back actually, and talk a bit about the origins of some of this work, because having hung out with growers and growing spaces for quite a long time now, I was really acutely aware of not finding out that spaces were at threat until the last minute, and then having had many groups come to me really panicking about what to do and trying to rustle up support at the last minute. And I thought there's got to be something we can do in advance of this. And also having had the privilege of hanging out with Gillian for quite a few years, and really knowing that the planning system can be on our side and not just against us. And I'd become curious with the idea of whether we might come up with a new designation for food growing spaces, something that was fairly unique and could almost be either done in conjunction with the local authority, or something that we just came up with ourselves as a collective to really show the value. And this was based on conversations that I'd had with some policymakers who'd been a little bit disparaging about, not all food growing spaces being quality, and having visited a number of spaces where there either wasn't an active community or there wasn't active growing. And so from there, Fee and Maya, the Capital Growth team, took away that sort of idea and worked with a group of growers to think a little bit more about what the next steps were. And this is where we have Growing for Change. So for those of you that might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the idea of designations and all the stuff that they've heard today, I suppose this is the first, we think this is the first step that you can take. So the development of this work really was about ensuring that community gardens are on a journey to be the best that they can for people and the planet, and I suppose best that they can within the resources and ability that they have as their group, and also to be able to show the impact and benefit and I suppose the wonder of community food growing, so that those policy and decision makers can support and be part of the help to protect your spaces. If they really understand and value your space, they will also want to respect it. And the first edition of this Growing for Change handbook was co-produced with this group of growers, and they came up with these core values which underpin, I suppose, the work that we hope you all support. So these core values around respect of people and nature, being tolerant, putting health and well-being and healing at the centre of your garden, and incorporating celebration. Now the next slide. Underneath that, the group also curated this set of guiding principles, and these principles and core values are part of the pledge that we're encouraging people to sign up to, and you can do this. I think at the moment this is just the Capital Growth members, so if you're in London and a food growing space, you can sign up for free, and you can sign up to our you can take this pledge, and these principles again are sort of a vision for your garden, and some guiding principles around being a welcoming and safe space, looking at your impacts on the environment and how you encourage wildlife, being experimental, adapting to climate change, sharing and being collaborative. So you can go into those, but I think these are also really good headings for you to have a discussion with your group about what this vision might mean to you. Next slide. And then, but what then? So within the guide, we've really focused in on your plan of action and what the next steps that you can take as a garden. So this is a series of indicators that cover people and planet. They look at things like engagement with the local community, which we've been hearing today is really key. Planners want to know that these sites are assets and of value to local people. how you consult and engage with the community, as well as some more basic stuff. And on the planetary side, it covers some of that stuff around water retention, soil health, biodiversity, your carbon footprint, and seasonal growing. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the next couple of slides. Next slide. So the toolkit is set out like a self-assessment guide. So it's a really simple way for you to review where you're at. You can celebrate your strengths. You can highlight areas where you want to make some improvements. And we're also looking at how we might digitize this assessment so that you can do it online, and also link it into some of the tools that can act as indicators. So, for example, for those of you that know of our Harvestometer, our Harvestometer is a really good way of looking at the productivity of your garden, the value of that, and also now the carbon saving that you might make through growing food locally. So we do encourage you to look at the Harvestometer. Maybe someone could put a link in case. And that, again, that is available to all gardens throughout the UK, not just in London. So this self-guided tour is what you're then, the next step that you can really take to think about, well, how am I going to demonstrate and show the value of our food growing space to those people that are interested in these wider impacts? And then the final slide. So for me, this is the exciting bit, following the sort of groundwork that Maya and the Community Gardeners Group have done, have worked on to put this stuff together. We're now really encouraging you to sign up to the Growing for Change pledge. We're looking at a new package of support for gardens who've made the pledge. So we would encourage you to be one of our pioneer gardens. We're thinking that around the first 150 gardens will be able to access our package of support that comes online in the new year. This will include things hopefully like visits and events and other ways to engage. And we're also going to develop this online tool to be able to help you track your progress. Alongside that, and it fits really well, we're always cooking up ways, new ways for gardens to be recognised. And biodiversity and nature recovery is feeling like it's a big agenda, and one that's really hotting up, particularly in London and for local authorities. And we've been talking to the Greater London Authority about their nature recovery strategy and how we can put food growing spaces at the heart of that. So we're really excited about how we can link biodiversity and nature recovery into this idea of protecting food growing spaces in the future. We think this is a really big opportunity. That's what Capital Growth is sort of here for. We're here to spot those real areas of opportunity that you can tap into to work with your growing space. And we really think that this work runs alongside everything that you've heard today. I mean, I was noticing in the local green space criteria is stuff around wildlife and accessing wildlife. So we know that this really ties in. So we're looking at how we can support the GLA and local authorities to establish the current picture of biodiversity and nature. So we'll be looking to engage a lot of our growing spaces in some sort of auditing. We're thinking bug counts and some exciting stuff that you could do with your community or with schools, and also some training that can help with that. And then looking at how we consult on what are the best ways to improve biodiversity and nature recovery through food growing. So do watch this space, do sign up to the Growing for Change pledge. Do feed in any ideas that you've got. We are thinking as well that we'll probably form a sort of nature biodiversity working group that can delve in a little bit more into that. So if that floats your boat, or if there's anyone in your groups that has a particular interest in that, do let us know. Currently this work will focus in on London, but we are definitely looking for other opportunities nationwide through our Sustainable Food Places and Good to Grow network. And we will open source as much as we can of the stuff that we develop. So for example, with the Harvestometer, it was funded by our London work, but we open source that so that everyone in the Good to Grow network can access it. So other than that, just to say, yeah, the key takeaway here is, act early and look at all the other benefits that making these changes and signing up to this pledge and measuring your impact can make. I can't emphasize enough, this is about sort of telling your story early, and I think you've had some great tips here today, and we're really, really here to help you take this process a bit further. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. And I'm really excited about what more will come with the Growing for Change campaign. So as Sarah mentioned, do keep your eyes peeled. We'll surely be advertising it in the newsletter, which if you aren't already signed up to, it's free. We send out on a monthly basis all the greatest updates around food growing in the capital. So definitely do sign up to the newsletter if you aren't already. So yes, and I think that brings us back to our Q&A bit. So before we kind of dive into the questions that would have been shared in the chat, we have a couple of questions for you. So Lily and Kate, would you be able to sort of share the Mentimeters questions, just 2 questions? And if you haven't already used Mentimeter before, it's just a platform where you'll visit a website, enter a code that Kate will add into the chat to answer these 2 questions, just to kind of get a feel for where things are at for you on the topic of protecting your food growing spaces after the chat so far. Lily, would you also be able to share your screen, please, so we can have a look at the Mentimeter responses as they come in live? Just give everyone a few moments to sign into that. And enjoy the quiet. Right, so it's just a case of going to the website. Sorry, Vicky's saying that the responses are off message when you click the link. Let me try that out myself. Oh, right, so Lily, you will have to turn on the responses. So let me see, because I can't actually see your screen. You should be able to press present.
It's not giving us the option to answer that question, I don't think.
So responding is off. It says press something to allow new responses. The screen.
Press C, is it?
Press C. Thanks for pointing that out, Vicky. So maybe it's the key C on your keyboard, actually, Lily. There you go. Ooh. There you go. Great. Okay. So those are people's responses coming through. And the question is, which of these statements best describes you? And we have, let me scroll down to that so I can see it. I run a community garden. I run a network of community gardens. I volunteer at a community garden. I work for a community garden. I grow food at home or in allotments. I work for a local authority. I work for a food partnership, or I volunteer for a different type of food project in the charity sector, or none of the above. For where people have said none of the above, if you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat what it is you might be representing today, just so we can capture that as well. Okay, great. Seems like there's quite a few people who are from community gardens. Fantastic. That's exactly the audience we were hoping to capture today, so that you can actually go and start initiating your protection for these sites. Okay, as those questions are going through, Lily, would you mind also going to our second question? There might be a little bit more typing to that, but I think it'll be important too. So if you just press the key C again, Lily, there you go. And here we're asking, what opportunities do you see for protecting your food growing sites? What opportunities do you see for protecting your food growing sites? Anything new that you might not have done up until now, or new ways of using what it is you do have, whether that's sort of data, whether that's people power skills, what sort of opportunities, or even new ways of thinking, perhaps, around how to protect your food growing sites. Hopefully the conversations, so all new info is new and useful. Okay, great. Hopefully we've lit an inner fire in folks to go after a local green space designation and learn about setting up a neighborhood forum and diving into local plans. One of our sites would fit the local green space criteria, so we'll look at that, although it looks like we needed to nominate sites before June. Okay, so somebody's already gone and looked at the local plan cycles. That's great. Great to see that in action, but still. If anyone else has anything to add? Local uni engagement. Ooh, nice. Student-led cafe biod measurements with the community. Okay. Training groups to use tools in Lambeth, working together proactively to influence the local plan, working with you to help spaces with evaluation. The local green space designation is interesting, not yet food growing, so that might be an option, but have a Facebook page and need to ensure we make that more active. Yes, that would be a great shout. Shouting about the great things your spaces do is never a bad thing. I think it also just engages people with those spaces, which is really important because this way you're demonstrating interest and value. So as long as you have people using that space, there will be more of a case for it not to be taken away, so to speak. From a local authority perspective, ensuring food growing sites get the right designations. Nice. Lily, would you mind scrolling down a little bit, please? I'll ask you, just scroll down perhaps. You should be able to just move. There you go. Thank you. Increased awareness of need for green spaces. NHS keen to use BCSE for preventing sickness and social prescribing. Yes, that's a very interesting one. I'm new to this as well. Not sure what the situation is for our garden, but getting on with the Growing for Change and documenting the value of a space sounds like a good place to start. I would agree. Yes, nice one. Local space designation is probably most straightforward. Nature designations such as sinks are also good where site not currently used for food growing. Yes, and that might be a sort of precursor to then establishing a food growing site and being able to apply for local green space, perhaps even if the local plan cycles isn't syncing or there isn't a sort of the right timing around it. Okay, great. I think now we can sort of crack on with any questions and put that towards our speakers for today. Thank you everyone for not just the information that you've shared, but also all of the contributions coming in through the chat. Really appreciate that. It has been nothing short of enlightening. If I could ask, Sarah or Kate, do you have any questions you'd be able to field my way?
Yeah, do you want me to just ask them?
Please.
Yeah. So there's a couple that came in from people when they were registering, so we can take a couple of these. Let me just find one have said, is metropolitan open land a good enough protection? And another person asked about a bit about the legislation regarding protecting of red space, which I think we've sort of covered that this is the legislation, I suppose. But there were some questions about, is metropolitan open land good enough, and also some questions about the size that you have to. Can you be too small to be a local green space? So there's some sort of technical questions there.
Right. Does anyone feel comfortable with answering that? Henry, Gillian, Henry, John?
I think on the second one, I've never heard that a local green space designation's been turned down on the basis that it's simply too small. I mean, it can't be a large tract of land, so one assumes that you can go down to quite a small space.
Right. Okay. I think a lot of the other ones that were asked earlier have been answered. So there was a question about, do all designations offer the same level of protection, and do they all require a similar level of evidence, or some more than others? I think we've sort of covered that, but I don't know if there was a sort of a short answer to that anyone wanted to. Gillian, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think the starting point is that any designation is going to help. But you do need the right policies in place, the supportive policies in your local plan, and then you are going to be in a campaigning situation, particularly if high land values are involved, and the landowner can throw as much money as they like to planning consultants to argue against you. So that's where your own evidence is needed. So it's a good starting point to have the designation, but it's not a time to be complacent.
And there was another question here about metropolitan open land. Is that a good enough protection? Someone was asking. I suppose it depends on what you define by good enough, but
yeah, well, again, it's a very good start, because it means that piece of land is recognised as being of strategic importance to London. But whether someone might justify nibbling away at your little bit, and they might then say, well, it doesn't matter, it's not going to affect the rest of the importance of the metropolitan open land. So you know, complacency is just not on the agenda for any of this. Get what you can, but then you're going to have to be vigilant.
Yeah. Okay. There's an interesting question here. What are the legal basis for councils to let public spaces for community gardens? And then the second part of it is permitted development or planning permission a way forward for creating infrastructure within community gardens, i.e. polytunnels, garden offices? I think there's two questions in here, isn't there? There's one about what's the basis for councils to let public spaces for gardens, and then the second is how you then, if there is any way to build on them, which is a bit more complicated. But the first one,
that's going to depend on what purposes they hold the land. So if it is a designated public open space, or if it's actually held in the housing account as part of a housing estate, or if it's held by highways as part of you know, a piece of open space that comes as part of the highways or the pavement area, or just they just inherited. So yeah, it absolutely depends on the particular circumstance of that piece of land as what scope they have then. But I mean, sort of generally speaking, you know, they have the ability to produce leases and to let short leases on their land. Yeah, just subject to covenants, really. So I think that's something that would need to be explored on a site-by-site basis. Using permitted development rights, I don't think there are any permitted development rights that would be particularly relevant. If a site already is in agricultural use, perhaps if it's a peri-urban site, then, and it was large enough, over 5 hectares, then it would have permitted development rights.
but on a community garden, that's not relevant, is it?
No.
So I think if you're setting up a community garden in an urban area and you want to build on it, you're going to have to go through the same hurdles that anyone would go through in order to build, right?
Yes.
I suppose temporary buildings might be allowed, but again, it depends on the agreement that you've got with your.
Yeah, but temporary buildings mostly need planning consent. They just get temporary consent.
Yeah.
Rebecca just mentioned, maybe we take one more question because there is a good one from Beth in the chat if you have it.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is there a conflict of interest if the land we would like to designate as local green space is owned by the council? Anybody would like to, perhaps John, do you feel like you might be able to answer that?
Would you just repeat the question just so I can hear it clearly?
The question is there a conflict of interest if the land we would like to designate as local green space is owned by the council?
I don't think there would be a conflict of interest. In some ways, it might be more likely to be successful, possibly. Because I think councils are obviously keen to hear from their voters about what's valuable to them, and if there is enough of a big campaign behind designating a portion of council-owned land as local green space, I think it could be quite successful.
But if they were going to promote it as a development site.
Yes, well, I mean, the councils are going to obviously be keen to build, but I think, I mean, some of the examples of cases where we've had some sort of success have often involved councils changing hands, with new councils coming in and having a lot of support behind to protect green space. So there is also the possibility of, you know, getting local councils on board before elections and promising to, you know, when in office, protect that area of land for the community. Not sure, Gillian, you say more.
Yeah, well, I think before, again, I would say, you know, it has to be done through the local plan. And when the draft local plan is published, there will be a list of sites with maps, and you need to go through those maps and see whether your site is on it or whether it's next to a site that's on it, to see what the implications for you are. And if it is a site that the council owns that they're going to promote for an alternative use, then that's the time to start your campaigns and to object to that proposal. And then it will have to go through the inquiry. process. So there's another reason to be vigilant, really, because you just need to look at every single tiny site that's going to be put forward as a site proposal.
Interesting.
I would agree with Gillian. I mean, there is a green space in North Kensington which was created by the local community 20, 30 years ago. And every time the local plan gets reviewed, we say, why don't you as a council designate that as a local green space? But they won't. And one suspects that's because they have always eyed it up as a potential housing site one day. So I think it's exactly as Gillian says. I don't think it's a conflict of interest as such, but it's ultimately that the council might have other designs on a piece of land, and in due course they can put that into effect through their local plan.
Nice. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm wondering whether that would essentially mean there's an importance to be able to make that link for councils and local authorities to understand the actual value beyond the sort of social benefits that a growing space might offer. So that it is considered as something that is on par, if not better than using that land for development, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that councils and other policy and decision makers are actually opening their eyes to the value of food growing. I feel like I've been banging on it forever, and it's nothing new, but all of a sudden, the world changes, and our CEO Kathy always says, by the time you're fed up with talking about it, everyone else has started to listen. So I think that there's a natural order to that. But we definitely saw it during the pandemic, when access to open space was, all of a sudden the thing, and people were almost clambering, and those that had access to a community garden felt like a privileged few. And we really felt like that needed to change sort of quite dramatically. Everyone should have access to an outdoor space. And so there was a real interest then. And more recently, the stuff I mentioned around the nature recovery, the GLA are really on board with seeing food growing, and actually sort of the urban farms that exist around the edge of London as really key to the nature recovery plan. So I think we need to jump on board that bandwagon, a bandwagon that we're already aware of. Oh, my battery's low, I might lose me in a minute. And really sort of start to demonstrate the nature and wildlife that we all, these spaces are absolutely brimming with nature and wildlife, and giving people in often, fairly deprived communities access to nature that they wouldn't otherwise have. People that live in flats and, haven't got gardens. So yeah, I think we really need to be champions of the nature value of our gardens.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's probably all we have time for in terms of questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours. Hopefully we'll be creating more spaces for these types of conversations to continue going forward under the Growing for Change campaign. So please do have a look at that and sign up to the pledge, and keep an eye out for the interesting developments around that. I just want to give a massive thanks to our speakers. So thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you very much, Sarah, and the tech team. Thank you, Kate and Lily, for stepping in, and everybody for all of your really great contributions, and that sense of we can actually do something about this. And I'm really excited with the whole empowerment that we have now that we're sort of understanding that we can get planning on our side. And it's a case of, building up our own capacity around that and being able to fight a good fight for it. So thank you very much for coming. The recording will be sent around by email by the end of this week. There is feedback. If Kate or Lily or actually would be able to, thank you very much, Kate, to pop that in the chat. It's a quick sort of under 10 minutes survey, just to kind of get a little bit of feedback on how you felt about how today's session went, but also what your takeaways are and how we could build on it. If there are any areas for improvement, we'd really appreciate that. Please do, if you haven't already, download the guides and give them a read through and share them out far and wide. Like we've mentioned, they aren't just relevant for London cases. They will have lots that are relevant pan-UK. So I definitely recommend doing that. And the last thing I'd like to plug is, if you haven't already seen this, and if it is of interest, we have published just last week a new fringe farming briefing that's showing the economic, social, environmental benefits of peri-urban food growing, looking at the case study of Organically in Chingford in East London. So if somebody can pop that in the chat as well, I think I might have, thank you, Kate. Oh, y'all are on it. Thanks very much. And I guess that's all. Thank you, folks, again. I will leave you to it with 1 minute to spare. So thank you. Have a great evening. Take care, everyone. Keep in touch. Bye.
So what I did, I think